During World War II, the top pilots, the elite of their time, were the aces from each nation. These aces, pilots who had downed 5 or more enemy planes, gained fame through their incredible feats in air combat. By the war's conclusion, only 3% of all fighter pilots had earned the title of ace. That small group was responsible for nearly 50% of all air-to-air victories between 1939 and 1945. What set them apart? An ace was undoubtedly exceptional, blending remarkable flying ability with bravery, sharp vision, and smart tactics. Those who survived their combat encounters were often the most calculated of all. These men skillfully balanced risk-taking with a calm, professional grasp of both their aircraft and their enemy's capabilities. The top aces chose their tactics by considering these two factors, along with the position they were in at the start of the engagement. Fighter tactics during World War II went through a significant transformation by the time VE Day ended the fighting. Despite these changes, the core elements remained unchanged. In fact, all the fundamental tactical principles had been established during World War I. However, it took time to relearn those lessons when Hitler's campaign in Europe began 2 decades later.
During World War I, air combat tactics evolved into 2 basic elements in the fighting over the Western Front. The first was the traditional swirling, turning dogfight that you see in all the World War I type air combat movies. But the Germans developed a real specialized tactic by 1918 to preserve their small fighter force on the Western Front. This was the hit-and-run tactic. They were able to dive into opposing formations, hit them, and then run away as fast as they could by high-speed dives. Well, during the 1930s, both of these elements of air-to-air combat were really lost as tacticians and theorists concluded that dogfighting was a thing of the past because of the high speeds that new fighter aircraft were capable of achieving.
The RAF was likely the most influenced by that line of thinking. Instead of prioritizing air-to-air combat between fighters, it devised a range of strict tactics aimed at concentrating the firepower of fighter formations on bombers. RAF fighters were viewed as interceptors, not tools for air superiority.
The mass attack tactics developed by the RAF during the interwar period proved to be an utter catastrophe during the initial stages of the Second World War. The main reason for this was the fact that when flying in these tight formations, only the squadron leader or the flight leader would actually be looking around for enemy aircraft. Everybody else was so busy flying wing on the other aircraft in the formation that they didn't have the opportunity to be looking for enemy aircraft. Consequently, they were constantly surprised and aircraft were lost that probably wouldn't have been lost had they been flying in looser formations. The other issue was the fact that taking these unwieldy, large, cumbersome formations and trying to maneuver them in a very, very fast dogfighting environment proved to be incompatible with the realities of modern air warfare.
While the RAF entered the war with fixed, deliberate tactics, the Luftwaffe adopted the opposite strategy. Their experience in Spain led them to apply the lessons of World War I. They used loose formations of 4 planes, called a swarm, divided into 2 plane elements called routes. These flexible formations gave pilots space to scan for enemy aircraft. As the British adapted, they gradually shifted from their pre-war methods to modified German formations. Initially, RAF squadrons flew in 3-plane formations known as VICs or Vs, with the leader positioned ahead and 2 wingmen tightly tucked behind. By early 1941, the British had adopted a 6-plane formation that was looser but flawed. It was a version of this formation that the RAF taught to newly formed American squadrons when they joined the fight against the Luftwaffe in 1942.
Basically, the British formation that we used was a box formation. A leader, a wingman behind him and slightly off to the side, element leader, and his wingman off a little bit to the side, almost a box.
From the RAF tactics that the U.S. Army Air Force inherited in North Africa and also in the early days in England, the pilots, the fighter pilots, the American fighter pilots, developed a new formation that they called the Finger Four. And it's very similar to the German Schwarm. But imagine 4 planes on the end of each finger, and each fingertip or fingernail representing the aircraft. The leader would be right here, the flight leader. His wingman is this guy right here. The element leader is here, and the element leader's wingman is in trail behind the rest of the formation back here. And the point of this formation was to fly as loose as possible while still being able to provide mutual support. And this way they could all be looking around for enemy aircraft and protect each other at the same time.
As formation tactics evolved, so did the fighter pilot's understanding of how to best use his aircraft against the enemy. Before the war, dogfighting was largely viewed as a one-on-one contest, with little emphasis on teamwork within a fighter formation. Once again, it was the Germans who reconnected with their tactical roots. In Spain, they learned the differences between dogfighting styles, hit-and-run tactics versus turning engagements. A light, nimble fighter was ideal for a turning battle, while faster aircraft with superior climbing and diving abilities excelled in hit-and-run tactics.
The Germans developed the best early war hit-and-run fighter in the Messerschmitt 109. The 109 was capable of amazing vertical maneuvers and performance. And as a result, they could dive down on British formations, hit them, make a pass, and climb away with their energy that they had accumulated in the dive, and engage and disengage the British at will, and the early American pilots as well. And this sort of attack caused a lot of losses amongst Allied aircraft and aircrew during the early days and early months of the war. The only thing that the British and the American pilots in 1940, 41, 42 could do was try to break away from these diving attacks and turn. And while that was a fine defensive maneuver, it made them entirely reactive. They could not really retain the initiative or capture the initiative away from this amazing energy fighter.
Anytime you got into a jam, attacked by 109, and they were usually above us, so they'd have the initiative initially. Anytime you were attacked by a 109, about the only thing you could do to keep from getting hit was to get into a tight turn, which he couldn't keep with you. And if you could persuade him to stick with you, you could eventually get around, work into position on his tail.
The Germans could never turn with you. A 109 had a much heavier wing loading, 32 pounds versus the Spitfire's Hurricane's 25. So a German wouldn't be fool enough to try and get on a tight turn with you. You'd nail him. You'd just turn inside him and shoot him. They knew that.
Occasionally, overly eager German pilots made the fatal mistake of trying to turn fight against Allied aircraft, and those pilots did not survive long.
I spotted a bunch of 109s came down from above us, and heading down toward the targets. Well, I turned my flight up into them, and tried to divert them, drive them off, which was kind of silly because there were about six or eight 109s, and we were 4 P-40s at that point. At any rate, we got into a big hassle going round and round, and I wound up with 3 of them on my tail, taking turns making passes at me. And as I had mentioned earlier, when they'd get within what I estimated was firing range, why I'd go into a turn and manage to divert them that way to the point where they couldn't pull enough lead to hit me. And one of them made the mistake of trying to turn with me, and in 2 turns I got around behind him and killed him.
As the war progressed and newer American designs entered the fray over Europe, the Germans saw the advantages of the Me-109 and FW-190 diminish.
From about mid-1943 on, German pilot quality really began to decline. And as it declined, Allied pilot quality increased as there was more breathing room to train the pilots more effectively and more thoroughly before they went into combat. And it was that fact, combined with the new aircraft that the Allies were just beginning to deploy, that could outclass the 190 and the Messerschmitt 109, that gave the Allies the edge they needed in the skies over Europe.
The P-47 Thunderbolt was the first of this new wave. At high altitude, nothing could surpass a Thunderbolt when flown by an experienced pilot. While primarily known as a hit-and-run or energy fighter due to its excellent diving capabilities, skilled pilots could engage Luftwaffe fighters in any type of dogfight with the P-47D and M models. With such a versatile fighter, the tactical situation usually determined how the fight would unfold. Whoever had the altitude advantage typically initiated the fight, aiming to keep the engagement vertical using hit-and-run tactics. At lower altitudes, energy fighters were at a serious disadvantage. If caught low and slow, they were vulnerable to turn fights with no way to escape. However, in skilled hands, the P-47 proved to be an exceptionally versatile fighter, even in low-altitude turning engagements.
We were on the deck, working on the deck, and I think we could outfly him on the deck. He couldn't get away from me. I could turn in and keep right with him, and so I just had him going, and he finally decided it better get out than to get shot down.
While the P-47 was highly effective, early P-38 pilots who faced the Luftwaffe in late 1942 and 1943 found themselves at a disadvantage. Initially, many P-38 squadrons made the costly mistake of attempting to turn fight with German 109s and 190s, often with disastrous results. Since the 109s and 190s were as fast or faster than early P-38s, American pilots often couldn't outrun their Luftwaffe adversaries unless they began the fight with an altitude advantage. Even the mid-war P-38 variants like the F and G models struggled in Europe, particularly in the bomber escort role. When flying close to the bombers, Lightning pilots frequently found themselves in tactically unfavorable situations.
A German plane could cut off their attack any time. All they had to do was dive. A P-38, this was a bad maneuver, because if we went into a dive and followed them while we got into compressibility, at first we couldn't pull it out of there. Compressibility is a high-speed buffet, and it's dangerous. They were up there hiding in the sun, and they'd roll over and come down at us, and for a while there we thought the Germans were after us instead of the bombers. We couldn't outturn them, and we couldn't dive with them. It was their show there for quite a bit. We didn't get as many of them, I guess, as they got of us. We had quite a few losses.
After some hard-learned lessons, P-38 units managed to hold their own against the Luftwaffe through 1943.
When you see them coming, you turn. They didn't like the front end of a P-38, and they had respect for us. You see, they didn't know what we could do. They had to learn just like we did how well we were going to perform against them.
By late 1944, however, the P-38L entered service in the European theater, offering the Americans a game-changing version of the Lightning. With hydraulic boost controls, dive brakes to prevent compressibility, and more powerful Allison engines, the L model allowed pilots to use tactics previously unavailable to them.
The original P-38 was kind of stiff. You had to really put effort. 1 pound here was 1 pound out there. But after they put those hydraulic boosters on it, 1 pound here was 16 out there. And boy, we could outroll Spitfires or P-51s or any of the rest of them with aileron boosters. And so the quicker you can establish your turn and pull back on the stick means a tighter turn you can make, see? And we could outturn anybody, and then it would turn right, being so stable, whenever a single engine plane gets down to about 91, 92 miles an hour, if you're turning to the right, and it stalls, it'll flip back over this way, out of control. P-38, you could turn it right down forever at 72 miles an hour at full power and never stall out. And getting that turn established was the main thing. Up until we got the dive flaps, every time we get in a fight with the Germans at altitude, we could outturn them. We could really outturn them. But the minute we got inside of them, they'd just turn over and go straight for the ground, 26,000 feet or wherever you were, say. And if we chased them, we got out of control. And the P-38 wanted to tuck back under like that, and the more you pulled on it, the more it would tuck under. It was out of control. So we had to have something that would keep it from accelerating past that speed. So they invented this dive flap that was run by electric motor, and it opened like that. It took about 1 second to open and close, you know. And the minute that guy in front of you pulled that split ass like that, you just pop those dive flaps and you just get right behind him. And boy, were they surprised after we got those, because they'd pull out at the bottom. 26,000 feet's not very fast to run, very far to run at 450 miles an hour, see. When they pulled out at the bottom, there was a P-38 right on their tail, you know. And that was their big surprise. That really, dive flaps, we called them dive brakes, but they were dive flaps, is what they were. They were really great. We could outturn them, we could outclimb them, we could outdive them, we could outlast them, and we could outgun them.
This late war version of the P-38 gave American pilots the confidence to engage the Luftwaffe in almost any tactical scenario, knowing that, in a pinch, they could fight their way out. Jim Byers recalls one battle that began unusually, with the Americans engaging from below.
They were above us to start with. And we were in a hole in the overcast, you know. We looked up and there they were, about 2,500 feet above us. And they were getting all queued up in an echelon. So I just took my flight right through the middle of them. And they scattered. And then we started picking them off. But none of them would fly out of that hole, see. They had to be inexperienced. We shot all 14 of them down, 11 of us. But our 11 guys accounted for over 700 missions. See, they were pretty well experienced by then, you know, see. God, there ain't no sense of letting them get the first shot, you know. And if you sit and do nothing, you get hurt. But if you make a mistake, you can change that, see. If you do something and make a mistake, you can change it. But if you just sit there and do nothing, you can't change anything.
In other cases, the P-38 became one of the war's deadliest hit-and-run fighters, especially when it started a fight with an altitude advantage.
And we looked off to the east, a whole bunch of ME-109s, about 20 of them, were attacking 4 P-47s. Coming down, boy, just like rain down out of the sky. So we flew over there and got in the fight, and we shot down 8 of them. All that happens fast, you know. You're scared, but you're not panicked. You know, see, that's the difference right there. Yeah, and anybody that says they aren't scared, they're useless, because anybody that is any good at all gets scared.
In 1944, the introduction of the P-51B by the 354th Fighter Group in Northern Europe marked a decisive turning point in the war. Finally, the Allies had a long-range air superiority fighter whose performance matched or surpassed that of any enemy aircraft. While the P-47's main weakness was its slow climb rate, the Mustang climbed like a homesick angel and could dive with the best the Luftwaffe had to offer. With no major weaknesses, the P-51 became the top all-round air superiority fighter of the war, excelling at any altitude.
That caught the Germans flat-footed there for a while. They really gave them a bad time. Because 51s, he'd catch the German Air Force in the air, and they'd drop those tanks, and then they'd cut them to pieces because the
the 51 could outturn the Messerschmitts. So they made out real well there.
By the war's end, the air battles had evolved into a fierce contest for positional advantage. In the early days, the Germans dominated the RAF with their sleek 109s and effective hit-and-run tactics. However, newer Allied aircraft arrived just in time to shift the dynamics of the air war. While still excelling in turn fights, Allied pilots gained unmatched flexibility with late-generation fighters, allowing them to engage the Germans in vertical hit-and-run combat and win. This versatility spelled the downfall of the Luftwaffe's fighter force by 1944. While various tactics could help mitigate an enemy's advantages in aircraft quality or quantity, some fundamental elements of air combat remained constant. Mastering these elements took time, which fighter pilots in World War II often lacked.
During World War II, American pilots used to say, "Fly 5 and stay alive." And what that meant was, if you made 5 missions, if you flew 5 missions and you were still alive, your chances of survival through your entire tour just went up exponentially. The reason for this was something that later was called situational awareness. SA was basically the ability to process all the information going on around a pilot in the midst of an air-to-air engagement. And developing the sense of situational awareness needed for survival in air combat took time. If a pilot could fly 5 missions, he'd have the experience needed to really understand and process the things that he saw. But before that point, he had no concept of what was going on around him. Frequently, pilots never even saw aircraft around them in an air-to-air engagement, and even more seriously, they rarely saw the aircraft that shot them down. As a result, it was the inexperienced pilots that made up the brunt of losses through the entire Second World War.
Dogfights are funny things. They're huge. They might go all over the sky. You lose track of your own people. Hopefully your wingman stays with you. If he doesn't, then you're in trouble because you not only have to watch what you're doing, you have to watch behind you. People who don't check 6 are in deep trouble. If they won't be victor, they'll be victim.
Identifying the enemy was the most crucial factor in winning any air-to-air engagement. Once the enemy had been spotted, maintaining visual contact was vital for securing victory. A common fighter pilot saying of the time was, "Lose sight, lose the fight." Without awareness of the enemy's next move, a fighter pilot couldn't choose the appropriate maneuver to counter it. This was a primary reason why many inexperienced pilots were lost. They simply couldn't see or process all the information unfolding around them. Sometimes, losing sight of friendly aircraft in his flight or squadron could be nearly as dangerous as encountering enemies in close-range turn fights.
One of my very first sightings of an enemy aircraft was a 109 who crossed in front of me. I turned and got headed towards him in a steep bank left, and all of a sudden he started coming apart, and I hadn't fired my guns yet, and it was Glenn Eagleston coming in from the other side had hit him. Glenn used to tell me all the time, "I owe you one." He says, we almost were air scoop to air scoop when he finally hit him.
If a fighter pilot managed to survive long enough to grasp some key lessons in air combat survival, he could become a highly valuable asset to his squadron.
During the war, to be a successful fighter pilot in air-to-air combat, you needed a couple of basic ingredients. The first was eyesight. A successful fighter pilot had good eyesight and could spot enemy aircraft at long ranges. The second was the ability to fly his aircraft to the edge of its performance envelope. Basically, he needed to be a good pilot. And kind of as a corollary to that, he needed to understand his aircraft as thoroughly as possible so he could get the most out of it. And that really came down to a number of hours that that particular pilot had flown in the fighter type he was taking into combat. Lastly, he needed to have a thorough understanding of the tactics that would maximize his aircraft's potential and capabilities in air-to-air combat, while at the same time negating some of the advantages the enemy aircraft possessed over his own aircraft.
Air-to-air gunnery was, and still is, a true art form that only a select few ever master. Dick Bong, America's ace of aces, spent his initial months in combat unable to hit anything except from almost directly astern. After extensive gunnery training in the States, he returned to combat and became an exceptional aerial marksman, striking targets from nearly any angle.
Deflection shooting was the ability to take out a target from different angles relative to that particular target's direction. So firing from directly astern on an enemy plane was called a 0-degree deflection shot, while shooting from a 45-degree angle from behind was called a 45-degree deflection shot. The most difficult shot was the 90-degree deflection shot, where the shooting plane was perpendicular to the target aircraft. That required the most amount of lead and the most amount of calculations in the pilot's head to actually hit the target. Deflection shooting was actually an art form. It was very difficult to do, and there were very few pilots who were really good enough to hit a target from anywhere except dead astern. So those that were able to do it really had very high scores. René Fonck was probably one of the most famous deflection shooters in aviation history. He was a World War I French ace with over 70 kills to his credit. During World War II, some of the great deflection shooters were Hans-Joachim Marseille, who was a German pilot who was renowned for his ability to bring down very rugged aircraft like P-40s with 7 or 8 shots. He was that good of a marksman. For the Americans, probably one of the best deflection shooters was Tommy McGuire, who had 38 kills and was the second-ranking American ace in World War II.
For much of the war, Americans relied on fixed reflector gun sights. Initially, the standard K9 gun sight was utilized. However, later in the war, the United States developed a computer gun sight known as the K-14. With the aid of a gyro, the gun sight would calculate the necessary lead to hit an aerial target.
We had a K-14 sight that was a gyro sight, and you put the pip on the plane, and if you were in too tight of a turn, though, you better have your stationary sight on too. And that happened to me, and I was pulling in a real tight turn, and the thing was gone. Just dumped. It would dump. You pull a gyro too fast, it'll dump. Then you got to shut it off and get it going again. And if I'd had my needle or ring and dot, I probably got him, but nothing I could do. So you had to be careful when you're in a real tight turn with that gyro. But it was a big improvement.
It was indeed rare for an individual to master all these complex and demanding elements of air combat and survive long enough to excel at them. Of those who did, only a select few became true hunters, the aces. Their domain was the expansive skies over Europe. Their task involved a grim cycle of killing and survival. Losses among the top aces were consistently high.
Throughout aviation history, aces have always been among the most aggressive pilots in the air, but some have been more aggressive than others. And these types of aces led brilliant, if short, careers in air-to-air combat. They were the reckless of the reckless. They were the ones who would wade into any fight, no matter what the situation, no matter how heavily outnumbered, and they would fight it out. And these guys scored incredible victories in a very short span of time, but generally they fell victim to their own recklessness in the end and died at the hands of their own mistakes in air-to-air battle.
Surviving in air combat required courage, skill, and a fair amount of luck. To evolve into a hunter rather than merely a target necessitated a healthy mix of experience, sharp eyesight, and effective tactics. It took time for all participants in the air war to relearn the fundamental lessons of air combat that emerged from World War I. However, once they did, a multitude of tactical innovations reshaped the air war in Europe. Poor tactics could result in the downfall of even the most skilled pilots. Conversely, effective tactics could counter nearly any advantage the enemy possessed, ensuring both survival and success.
After the invasion, it was before the fall of Paris. Anyway, we were escorting bombers. As soon as we have enough of the enemy planes leave, that the bombers are not in any additional danger, we could choose to chase one of the enemy planes down when they were going away from the fight. So we fought from 30,000 to about 5,000, doing every kind of maneuver you could think of, trying to trick the other one. But I finally got some hits on his engine. Well, that started smoking. Made him nervous. So he said, well, I'm going to fly over Paris. They got thousands of gunners in Paris that could all shoot at him. They gave me a better chance to be clear of it. Well, I followed him right on in over Paris. And he was getting even more nervous. So he chose the route to fly under the Eiffel Tower. And I was hot on his tail. He came through, I came right through. But when he had to pull up, you don't have a choice of going anywhere except straight ahead at first until you get some altitude. So he was sitting right in my gun sight. What finished him off there as he pulled out of the trip under the Eiffel Tower. And funny thing about it, years later, I'm still running into people, some Parisians, some people who just happened to be in Paris during the occupation. And they say, we celebrated for 3 days because you got that trick in. So I thought that was pretty nice to have it confirmed by the viewers and so forth, the people who saw the event. I didn't report it. When we got over there in the situation with the PR people and everything, and we also found out that some of the pilots claimed some doubtful claims and having their wingmen swear to it and so forth. I decided I wasn't get into that, so I never put any claim of any kind. But the other fellas, I had to tell it, but not to the officials. We were assigned the Russian shuttle mission. We were to Russia, 5 missions out of Russia, out of Italy from Russia, 5 missions out of Italy. The Spitfires and P-39s missions were limited by their fuel capacity to 2-hour missions. And when we were assigned to go to Russia and Italy, they sent over a Australian who had flown with the RAF 2 tours, no mission over 2 hours. Well, he was on my wing his first mission that was going to exceed 2 hours. It actually was 8 hours by the time we landed in a grass field in Russia. He did lose enthusiasm rather rapidly as the hours piled up. But we had a lot of fun. Russia was very unfriendly. They had some tents set up with holding monks signed to and told me where I was supposed to sleep. I see some P-39 sitting over there on the same field that we landed. I started over to them, and the Russian guards, "Stoy!" Made it clear they wanted me to stop. So I stopped, but here I was, American pilot with hundreds of hours in a P-39, more than they had, though we hadn't been sending them to them very long. And they did something to increase the altitude. P-39 was sluggish at altitude. The way we had it was not supercharged. So maybe they supercharged it and got good flight characteristics at altitude. Well, one interesting thing that happened on that shuttle mission, we stayed there a while and flew missions out of Russia back to Germany and on. Then we ran into some beet vodka. Now, I was familiar with potato vodka. I never run into beet vodka before. I thought it would be real nice to bring some along and share with my buddies. So I eliminated ammunition and put in beet vodka. So I was leading. I was as safe as I could be. I didn't eat anything. We got over Palesti on the way to Italy. Ran into a bunch of German 109s. But they took off and ran. They didn't want to travel with us at all. They just leave, go. The last one that was running away rolled over, bailed out. He may have had engine trouble or nerve trouble, or I don't know what happened to him, but he rolled over and bailed out. And of course, the officials rule at the closest plane too. So in a situation like this, I was leading the flight. I was the closest one to him. But I could never claim one that had no ammunition except beet vodka. So that was not exactly the time to be claiming planes down.
He may be the only person in history who fell in love with flight because President Calvin Coolidge took a vacation. A baby-faced Swede who flew a trainer in a loop around the center span of the Golden Gate Bridge. He was a stunningly talented pilot. It was said of him that he thought more quickly in 3 dimensions than most people did in 2. His string of combat victories over New Guinea turned him into a national hero. He shot down an incredible 40 enemy aircraft before being removed from combat once and for all. A national treasure who could no longer be risked on the battlefield. When the endless cycle of parades and war bond rallies wore him down, he asked for and received assignment as a test pilot in the secret program that produced America's first combat jet. He is Richard Ira Bong, and he is a legend of air power. Richard Ira Bong was born September 24, 1920 in Superior, Wisconsin. Superior is a small town at the western tip of Lake Superior and about as far north as you can be in Wisconsin without being in Minnesota. His father, Carl, had come to the United States from Sweden at the age of 7. He worked his way halfway across the continent before settling as a farmer in Poplar, Wisconsin, 20 miles to the southeast of Superior. Carl Bong married Dora Bryce and settled in to start a family. Richard was the first of their 9 children, a quiet, thoughtful boy who grew up hunting and fishing in the dense forests around his family's farm. Known from an early age as Dick, he was first taken with aviation at the age of 8, when President Calvin Coolidge decided to spend a summer vacation in Superior.
And every day the mail would be delivered by a courier, air courier, and Richard saw the plane going over it every day, and I think it just fascinated him, and I think that was the start of his love affair with aviation, and it just built from there.
When the presidential party left town, so did the air couriers, but aviation had made its impression on young Dick. He contented himself with building model airplanes and dreaming of the day when he would learn how to fly. He played basketball, baseball, and hockey. He was a fisherman and hunter, played clarinet in the school band, and was active in the local 4-H club. He was, like almost everyone else in Poplar, a Lutheran, and he sang tenor in the choir every Sunday morning at Bethany Lutheran Church. Poplar was a town so small that its high school only lasted 3 years. To complete his senior year and make himself eligible for college and the civilian pilot training program, he commuted 44 miles round trip every day to Superior. In 1938, he graduated 18th in a class of more than 400. He attended Superior State Teachers College and enlisted in the civilian pilot training program. That government-sponsored flight training system was designed to boost the number of experienced pilots in the United States. The government justified the program based on the growing need for airmail and commercial pilots. In reality, the government's main concerns were the wars that were brewing in Europe and Asia. There was going to come a time, military planners believed, when the United States would need a lot of pilots quickly. Bong earned his pilot's license in a Piper J3, and almost from the first showed a gift for aviation.
He had a knack for it, and he learned that through the pilot training programs he had been in college and afterwards, that he was just a natural pilot, and that was the word that everybody used to describe him in all of his pilot training programs. He was just a natural pilot. He loved it, and it became evident in the performance he turned in as a pilot.
In 1941, Bong enlisted in the Army Air Aviation Cadet Program. In May, he shipped out to far-off and exotic California. He did his primary flight training in a Stearman biplane outside Tulare. He caught on quickly and moved on to flying Vultee BT-13s, the famous Vultee vibrator at Garner Field in Taft.
He was, as I said, a natural pilot. He had natural skills, natural abilities, and in those days, you didn't get a whole lot of instructions.
Most of the pilots at Gardner simply flew, running up their hours and getting a feel for maneuvering in 3 dimensions. Bong quickly distinguished himself and was ordered to report for gunnery training. At Luke Field near Phoenix, Arizona, he moved from the BT-13 to the AT-6, a single-engine fighter trainer that was smoother and more capable than the Vultees he'd been flying, but sluggish compared to real combat fighters. His gunnery trainer was Captain Barry Goldwater, the future senator and presidential candidate. Goldwater, a tough, precise teacher, said later that Bong was a talented pilot, and those years hunting with his Winchester rifle in Wisconsin had honed his shooting skills. But Bong really proved himself one afternoon in an informal, impromptu hassle high over Luke Field. Bong, flying an AT-6, squared off against a Czech pilot in a P-38. The dogfight should have been a mismatch. The P-38, after all, was much faster and more agile than the AT-6, and the Czech pilot had hundreds of hours more flight time than Bong. But no matter how the P-38 pilot maneuvered, he couldn't keep Bong off his tail. The two would square off, and in a few seconds, Bong would be closing in on the P-38 from behind. The Czech pilot, upon landing, pronounced Bong the best natural pilot he had ever seen. Bong was at Luke when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Like the other pilots, he wanted into the war as soon as he could get there. A month later, he received his wings and his officer's commission. But rather than sending him into combat, the Army kept him at Luke as a gunnery instructor. Dick Bong's war seemed to end before it had started. For almost 6 months after the American entry into World War II, Second Lieutenant Dick Bong was stuck stateside. As a gunnery instructor at Luke Field in Arizona, he trained other young fighter pilots and then watched as they departed for points unknown overseas. In May 1942, however, the Army Air Force assigned Bong to Hamilton Field in San Francisco. There, pilots were learning how to fly the new Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter. The P-38s were big, fast, and had proven themselves unsuitable for combat in Europe. The cooling systems for the plane's twin engines froze up at low temperatures common at altitudes over Europe. The pilots training in P-38s at Hamilton all understood where they were headed: the Pacific. After arriving at Hamilton, Bong quickly came to the attention of Major General George C. Kenney, commanding general of the 4th Air Force. Bong was both a gifted pilot and an incorrigible hot dog. On training flights, he liked to dip down low and buzz San Francisco's downtown. Showing off for the civilians seemed to be his greatest joy in life, and it got so bad that General Kenney put out an official order that such antics would not be tolerated.
Well, as most pilots are prone to do, he disregarded that instruction and, in fact, went out and did a couple loops around the middle span of the Golden Gate Bridge, went down Market Street waving at the secretaries as he was buzzing through town, and had gotten so low that evidently he blew down somebody's laundry. And that woman actually filed a complaint with General Kenney.
Kenney knew, of course, that Bong's juvenile clowning was not altogether a bad sign. There's a long tradition of cocky fighter pilots indulging their whims. Indeed, Kenney knew that confidence and spirit were traits necessary for fighter pilots to survive in combat. Still, he was a general, and generals have to at least attempt to keep a lid on their pilots. He disciplined Bong regularly, making him wash, dry, and fold the laundry he had blown off the clothesline, for example. But he also took note of the young pilot's enormous skills in the air.
He actually spotted the spark, I think, when he called him on the carpet in his office. He was, I don't know what he was expecting when this pilot walked in the door, but here comes this, average size 5'8", blonde-haired, baby-faced Swede who appeared to be scared to death that he was going to lose his wings.
Bong's passion for flight so impressed Kenney that when General Douglas MacArthur chose Kenney to set up the 5th Air Force Base in the Southwest Pacific, Kenney made sure that Bong was one of the first pilots sent to his new base in Australia. He arrived in September, springtime in the Southern Hemisphere. For more than a month, Bong sat around in Brisbane awaiting delivery of his plane. In November, Kenney assigned him to temporary duty with the 35th Fighter Group based in Port Moresby, New Guinea. New Guinea at the time was a hornet's nest of Japanese aircraft. MacArthur's campaign to reclaim the Philippines had just begun. American forces were beginning the bloody harbor-to-harbor conquest of New Guinea. The Japanese were throwing everything they could at the arriving American forces. The Army Air Force used a kind of sink-or-swim training method, throwing green pilots into the periphery of battles to ready them for full-fledged air combat. Flying under the careful tutelage of an experienced combat pilot, Captain Tom Lynch, Bong flew long patrols and skirted air battles for nearly a month, learning from Lynch the best tactics for fighting in a P-38. Then, on December 27, 1942, Bong got his first real taste of battle. He was in a flight of 12 P-38s led by Lynch. The flight intercepted 40 Japanese aircraft over Buma on New Guinea's northwest coast. Badly outnumbered, the P-38s charged headlong into the formation. Bong showed no sign of the fear he surely felt. He scored a Zero fighter and a Val bomber. Altogether, the P-38s knocked down a dozen Japanese aircraft. Bong, who had never been in real combat before, earned a Silver Star for his actions. From that point on, in dependable, almost unspectacular fashion, Bong began to compile what turned out to be the finest combat record in the history of American aviation. It took him only until January to become an ace, scoring his 5th kill over Leh Harbor. In February, Bong left Lynch's shadow and returned to the 9th Fighter Squadron. On March 3rd, on the opening day of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Bong flew escort for a flight of B-25 and B-17 bombers attacking a Japanese convoy. Bong knocked down a Zero. The bombers sank 4 Japanese destroyers and 8 transports. 1 and 2 kills at a time, Bong upped his total. Kenny promoted him to first lieutenant and gave him a 2-week leave in Australia. By then, a double ace, Bong enjoyed his R&R but longed to get back into action. The Japanese were throwing thousands of aircraft at the advancing Allies, creating aces almost as fast as the Allies could get pilots into the air. But Bong, perhaps uniquely among American pilots, seemed more interested in the experience and challenge of flight than he was in his kill count.
He was an introvert on the ground, shy even. In the air, became a different person, became the ultimate fighter pilot.
On July 26, Bong had his best day ever. Escorting American bombers attacking Lae, he knocked down 4 Japanese fighters. General Kenny, who had been so impressed by Bong's skills in training, could barely believe how proficient a warrior the unassuming Swede had become. He put Bong in for a promotion to captain and filed an after-action report that resulted in Bong receiving the Distinguished Service Cross. Bong was, in fact, emerging as a leader in the almost unspoken competition among pilots to become the ace of aces. He became one to watch. The press started wiring accounts of his combat accomplishments back stateside, and his name started to be mentioned in speculation about whether an American pilot would break Eddie Rickenbacker's seemingly unbreakable record from World War I, 26 combat victories. In November 1943, Bong shot down his 20th and 21st enemy aircraft, a pair of Zeros over the airfield at Brabal. General Kenny, knowing that his ace pilot was as valuable as a morale-building hero as he was in the air, gave Bong a 60-day leave to return home for a visit. Bong met with General Hap Arnold, posed for a few pictures, and then returned to Poplar, Wisconsin to enjoy, as ordered by Kenny, a little home cooking. The leading ace of the war was welcomed home as a hero, and while being crowned as honorary homecoming king at his old college, he met Marjorie Vattendahl, the 19-year-old homecoming queen. For the next 2 months, if he wasn't busy appearing at war bond rallies or launching ships for the war effort, he and Marjorie were together. By the time he left Poplar on the long journey back to the Southwest Pacific, he and Marjorie were in love. Captain Richard Bong returned to the Southwest Pacific as the leader in the race to become the ace of aces, in hot pursuit of Eddie Rickenbacker's combat kill record. Bong slapped his girlfriend's picture on the nose of his new P-38, which he christened Marge. 5 victories behind the record set by Eddie Rickenbacker in World War I, he went into battle with the whole world watching and an advantage over his competition. He was assigned not to the 9th Fighter Squadron, but to 5th Air Force Headquarters. In the competition to become ace of aces, the flyer with the most kills, Bong had become the favorite. The press had gathered to watch his achievement. While other pilots' assignments were limited to specific geographical areas where there might or might not be enemy activity, General Kenny allowed Bong to roam where he liked, in search of action and Japanese planes to shoot down. But they increased slowly. The number of Japanese aircraft had decreased, and the enemy was shifting to a more defensive posture. That limited the number of mass attacks that had created so many American aces. The Southwest Pacific was about as unnatural a habitat for the Wisconsin farm boy as it's possible to imagine. Hot, humid, bug-infested, and moldy, it was a place that seemed to reek of death. Bong went out almost daily, enduring long, boring patrols. Often he found no enemy aircraft at all. When he did, the combat lasted only minutes, and then a long return flight, often over open water, to inhospitable accommodations. That was his reward. On February 15th, the day after Valentine's Day, Bong recorded his first kill in the plane he'd named for the girl back home, Marge. It was his only official kill for the month, though he did destroy a transport as it sat on the runway. The transport, it turned out, was loaded with high-ranking Japanese officers, and while it didn't count on his kill total, it struck a significant blow to the Japanese war effort. On March 8th, the tedium of the war turned to tragedy. Bong had reunited with his former commander from the 35th Bomber Group, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Lynch. The two were flying over Atape Harbor, New Guinea. Bong watched helplessly as his old friend and mentor spun down to his death. For the next month, Bong was ineffective in combat. He flew, but he didn't score any kills until April 3rd, when he knocked down his 25th enemy aircraft. The press gathered in anticipation. The folks back home waited for word of Bong's heroism. On April 12th, Bong shot down 3 enemy planes in a single day, shattering Rickenbacker's record. The news splashed around the world. Rickenbacker sent a telegram congratulating Bong and promising to send a case of scotch as a reward. General Kenny, doubly pleased that the record had been broken by an officer in his command, sent a case of champagne. Back in the States, Middle America was scandalized that people would send alcoholic beverages to a pilot in a combat zone. To quell the uproar, General Hap Arnold made a big show of shipping Bong 2 cases of Coca-Cola. Arnold slipped the press copies of his personal note to Bong, stating that America's newest hero would certainly prefer America's favorite soft drink. Bong, still the cheerful, baby-faced kid from the North Woods of Wisconsin, was having a ball. What he didn't realize is that by becoming the ace of aces, he had become a national treasure, too precious to risk in combat.
After he broke Rickenbacker's record at 26 victories, they did everything they could to the point of sometimes setting him down or sending him back on, publicity campaigns and things like that back in the States to keep him out of harm's way.
He returned to the United States, went on a war bond tour, and most importantly, proposed to Marge Vattendahl. He didn't return to combat for 5 months, reporting to General Kenny in September 1944 as a gunnery instructor. He could fly, but he was only allowed to fire in self-defense. He defended himself a lot. He shot down 5 enemy planes in October and 3 more in November. Kenny suggested to General Douglas MacArthur that Bong ought to get the Congressional Medal of Honor. MacArthur agreed and forwarded Kenny's request up the chain of command. In December, Bong went to Tacloban to receive the Congressional Medal from General MacArthur himself. In December, Bong shot down 4 more planes, bringing his total to 40. General Kenny, who had bent every rule to keep Bong flying, once and for all, pulled him out of combat. He shipped his favorite pilot back home, armed with a personal letter to General Hap Arnold and 6 bottles of Coca-Cola for the flight. Bong arrived back in the United States on New Year's Eve, 1944. He went to Washington, met with Hap Arnold, and participated in what seemed like an endless stream of public appearances, including a press conference with Eddie Rickenbacker. He broke away in February and returned to Wisconsin. There, in the Concordia Lutheran Church, he and Marge married. After his honeymoon, Bong received the plum assignment of flight testing the P-80 Shooting Star, the first American jet. He made 11 flights in the P-80, immersing himself in the theory and engineering of jet engines. On August 6th, he pointed the nose of his jet down the runway for his 12th flight. The plane rolled down the runway perfectly, but as it rose into the air, the engine flamed out.
Here's a guy that had, 200 missions, combat missions in the Pacific, shot down 40 enemy airplanes, was shot at on a daily basis, won the Congressional Medal of Honor, comes back to what's supposed to be a relatively safe stateside job, and dies in an accident on takeoff in an experimental airplane, the P-80, in California.
Dick Bong, the ace of aces, died the day the Enola Gay dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima. His death, which would have made headlines almost any other day of the war, made barely a ripple in the public consciousness on that particular day. The bomb had dropped. The war Bong had fought in so heroically was about to end. As the whole world prepared to celebrate the end of World War II, Poplar, Wisconsin mourned. In tiny Poplar Cemetery, Dick Bong came home for good.
Of the three great airplanes I think the Germans produced in the war, I would say the Ju-88, the Focke-Wulf 190, and the Me-262 were the three. The Ju-88, in my opinion, was a first-class medium bomber. The Ju-88 G4, for example, had a top speed of 400 miles an hour, which was 6 miles an hour faster than the 190 BA4 at that time, its contemporary fighter. So it was a formidable airplane. And also the Germans had learned from the mistakes of the previous medium bomber, the Heinkel 111, where you had the crew separated by the bomb bay. You had the flying crew up to the front and the defensive crew at the back. But there could be a breakdown in communication. And also there could be a breakdown in morale if you have the two separated. They had learned to put the four crew of the Ju-88 into one glass house, I think you would call it, on the fuselage. And the crews themselves were very enthusiastic about the airplane. I flew it quite a lot, that and the 188. The 188 had a rather different rudder effect, and I would say it had improved slightly over the Ju-88, but a negligible amount. It still had the good flying characteristics of the 88. In fact, slightly better. And I was very impressed with both types of aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190, as a fighter, was first class. There's no question of that. It was an outstanding airplane. And inevitably, as the war progressed, there were attempts made to keep up with the hunt, so to speak, and give it a variety of roles. And there were many different marks of 190, and it eventually gravitated into the fighter bomber. In that role, it was quite effective, actually. Fighter bombers have a limited role. They are used against what I call targets of opportunity. You don't use them to come in and bomb an industrial layout. What you do is you use them to shoot up trains or convoys you see on the road. And from this way, the Focke-Wulf 190 was very effective again. So it was a versatile aircraft. And as it progressed, it eventually had an engine change. The Dora, the later Dora, was a magnificent fighter with an engine change and not really any structural changes other than those to accommodate the engine. But what it meant was, here was an airplane that could keep up with the hunt as the years of the war progressed. So from 1942 right up to the end of the war, the Focke-Wulf 190 was in the top grade of fighter or fighter bomber. Now, the ME-262 was, in my opinion, I've stated this many times, the most formidable aircraft of World War II. When you consider that at the end of the war, the top Allied fighter was the Spitfire Mark 14 with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. When we tested the Messerschmitt 262, it had a top speed of 568 miles an hour. This was a quantum jump in performance, and it meant the 262 was virtually inviolate. It also handled quite well in the air. It had no nasty characteristics really, except if you lost an engine on takeoff before you reached safety speed. But apart from that, I was very impressed. It had two shortcomings, but all the early jets did in our country, in America and in Germany. Firstly, the engines were very sensitive. They were slow to accelerate to throttle movement, and you had to handle them very carefully to avoid flaming them out. Secondly, we hadn't thought, or the designers hadn't thought, of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. And this made life very difficult, for example, for landing. You need some drag if you're going to land, and since there was very little drag associated with the 262, you had to do a long, slow approach to landing. And this was an Achilles heel, because the 8th USAF Mustangs realized this, and the few 262s they picked off was usually in that phase of the operation.
This is Bob Hoover of North American Aviation, who always gives a tremendous display of precision flying with the North American P-51.
Bob Hoover. He used to be a test pilot, one of the best. Today, he's manager of customer relations for North American's Los Angeles division, and he's the man who demonstrates this plane.
I never felt that I was any better than any other pilot. I just felt this is what I want to do, and I want to do it to the best of my ability.
If you're interested in or involved with aviation, you'll likely know something about Robert Anderson Bob Hoover. Yet he did so much and touched so many during his long life and career that even his admirers might be surprised at all that he did. On the other hand, if you're not familiar with the history and evolution of American aviation, there really is no quick way to describe the true American hero, the authentic national treasure known as Bob Hoover. My name is Sean D. Tucker. I have flown thousands of performances as an airshow pilot. It's likely I'm alive today because of the lessons and the warnings I've received from my friend Bob Hoover. And by the way, I could introduce you to a banquet hall full of people who will tell you the same thing.
Right now, for the Roberto Mustang! Here's a fun one. It's the Holy Hotfire. Right, runner. Left name was forward. Let's go.
The immortal aviation pioneer, Medal of Honor recipient, and Air Force General Jimmy Doolittle once called Bob the greatest stick and rudder man that ever lived. I don't know, but I'd take Jimmy's word for it. Bob was certainly the best I ever saw. But there is no Bob Hoover elevator speech. I can't tell you he was the first pilot to solo across an ocean nonstop, or a combat fighter ace. He wasn't the first pilot to exceed the speed of sound, or to walk on the moon. But I can tell you that Bob Hoover had the complete respect and admiration of the pilots who did those things. They knew that Bob Hoover not only possessed a transcendental gift for flying airplanes, but also a set of core values that invariably drove him to do the right thing for his fellow pilots, for his employer, for his country, for aviation. I was honored to be one of the celebrants of his memorial service when he left us in late 2016. I'll admit, I didn't always understand all the dimensions of Bob Hoover's gift. It took me a while to completely grasp all that Bob Hoover knew about flying and all that he had done in his life, a life that was so inspired, so courageous, and so fully lived that if you proposed it as a book or a movie, it would probably be rejected for being too far-fetched. But I can assure you that Bob's life and Bob's gift were real. They were as real as it gets.
It was during the Depression era, of course, when I grew up, and my father had to work at 2 jobs in order to put food on the table. As soon as I was old enough, I had to start earning my own money just for lunches and at school and any spending money I wanted. And when I got to 16, I got a job in a grocery store on Saturdays, and as a result, I earned $2 a day. And if I got any tip for carrying out groceries, that would be another 15 or 20 cents. And I was so interested and enthused about aviation, I'd been building model airplanes and even some that you could fly with a rubber band. And when an airplane would fly over, I'd run outside and look at it. It wouldn't be very often, but it was a big thrill to me to see an airplane flying. And then I'd ride my bicycle to the airport, and it was quite a ride. And then I would
get 15 minutes flying time, so it took me for a long time to get enough hours to solo. And then once I soloed, I fought nausea throughout the whole time frame. Just absolutely sick every time I'd get in the air. So I had to overcome that. But I kept pushing myself right into the threshold of nausea every flight, and I'd keep doing it until I got over it, and then I went to something else.
And at 18, when I graduated, I already knew what I wanted to do, and I'd already learned to fly. And I had encountered every obstacle you could find about not being able to fly. I found out my eyes were weak, and I also found out that I had nausea, air sickness every time I got off the ground. My first flight, that was devastating to me because I dreamed of nothing else. And I decided that I was not going to accept that I could not do what I really wanted to do, and that was to become a pilot.
I was not going to accept that I could not do what I really wanted to do. Time and time again, throughout his life, Bob's resolve to speak and act according to his own conviction put him at odds with authority and often in very real physical danger. At the same time, that determination had everything to do with his greatness as an aviator and an American. Bob Hoover was 18 years old in 1940. He graduated high school that spring. College was never a consideration. He was laser focused on his dream of flying. In the Tennessee of that era, with money tough to come by, the most probable pathway to the cockpit for Bob Hoover was to join the Tennessee Air National Guard.
By the time I joined, I was 18, I was in the service. And as an enlisted man, as a gunner, thinking that if I joined the Air Guard, and that's what I did, that the pilots would probably give me some stick time, which they did. They were very generous.
Flying time, stick time as pilots call it, is everything to a new pilot. Bob Hoover was a young man who had done every job he could from the time he was 12 years old, delivering newspapers, stoking coal furnaces, stocking grocery shelves in order to get stick time.
I decided I'd start experimenting with maneuvers, and I started teaching myself acrobatics. And I just thought, well, if the airplane will roll, what if you stopped it here and here like this? And so I started working on that. It didn't bother me. And I did it to 8 points. Then I went to 16 points. And I was doing inverted maneuvers.
This self-designed training program yielded an interesting result when Bob began flying in the National Guard.
So I went off to flight training, and I got there and got my first check ride. This instructor said, I'd like to show you a slow roll. Is that okay? And I said, yes, sir. And he did one, and he said, would you like to try it? And I said, yes, sir. Boy, he said, you can do it as well as I can. He said, what else can you do? So I did this for him, and he's looked at me, in the mirror and shook his head. We got on the ground, and he went into the commandant's office, and he said, sir, I've got a problem. And the commandant said, well, just go ahead and wash him out if he's a problem. He said, you don't understand. He can fly better than me or anybody I've ever seen fly. Next thing I know, he called me in, the commandant did, and he said, I want you to give check rides to all of the instructors. And so the whole time I was in primary, I didn't learn anything. I was teaching. Finally, they lowered the age from 21 to 18 for pilot training. And my commanding officer said, all the pilots say you've got a lot of skill, young man, and you don't have to go to flight training. We'll just commission you right here, and you can fly all of the airplanes.
But for young Bob Hoover, that wasn't quite enough.
I think we've got storm clouds over Europe and I believe someday we're going to be in a conflict of war, and if we are, I want to be out there fighting, and if I accept the commission here, I'll have an O in my wing shield, and that means observation pilot, and you cannot fly combat. And I had wanted to be a fighter pilot in the worst way, and so I asked him, I said, sir, could you get me an assignment to flight training so I could be qualified for combat? And he said, well, of course I can.
Bob had vision problems all his life. He wore fairly thick glasses for as long as I knew him. But to be a fighter pilot in World War II, you needed to begin flight training with 20/20 vision. If your vision degraded during training, you might be allowed to fly with corrective lenses, but not to start with. Once again, Bob's gift provided the way around an obstacle. The flight surgeon who would test his vision had seen him fly.
And he said, all the Air Guard pilots tell me how skilled you are. And he said, I want you to pass this exam, but I'm concerned that you're going to have to work awful hard to get it. So he was trying to clue me. Sergeant, he said, I've got a couple of things I've got to do in my office. And when I come back, I want you to read that bottom line for me. So he gave me about 30 minutes to memorize the letters and two lines, the two lower lines that I couldn't read. It's sort of an interesting thing. I went through the same flight training as a cadet did. And when we graduated, I was still a sergeant. And all the rest of the people were officers, and they didn't have any experience like I had at all. But here I was a sergeant, and when we went into fighter training, I was made a flight leader just right off. Well, then about a month later, my commanding officer called me in, and he said, I'm putting you in charge of 67 fighter pilots, and you're headed for England.
Now his country needed defending, and he had managed to become a trainer of trainers. He could barely contain himself.
I was enthusiastic. I had high ideals and expectations because I had learned a lot of things about aviation that other people had not had an opportunity to do.
But Bob had another obstacle to overcome. The Army Air Corps' plan for him did not include flying combat.
We got to Africa, and when we arrived there, I was the first to get an assignment. And boy, I was just anxious to go. And I checked into where I had to check into, and they said, we're separating you from your men, and you're going to be testing airplanes, taking them up for their first time. They're coming overseas in ships. We've already got 2 shiploads waiting now to be assembled. And when they get them assembled, you're going to fly them around and check them out until they're ready to go to combat. I said, boy, I wanted to go to combat. we had a few translators who were French, and they could communicate with them, and we had some people that could communicate with the French. Well, that's a hell of a way to build an airplane. And they assembled these airplanes, and I tell you, it was death-defying. Every time I flew, there'd be something wrong drastically, and I'd have to fly the same airplane sometimes 6 or 8 times to get rid of all the squawks to make sure that it was ready to go into combat. That was with P-40s and P-39s.
Though disappointed at not being in the fight, Bob took to the flying as he always did.
Every time I fly, even to this day at my age, I want to do it better than the last time I was in that airplane. And I try to be more precise, whether it's aerobatics, keep my hand in with all phases.
Loyalty was a watchword with R.A. Bob Hoover. His friends, his fellow pilots, the Air Force, his country. Anyone or anything who mattered in Bob Hoover's life could count on his unfailing loyalty. Probably no one knew that better than his friend and fellow Air Corps pilot, Tom Watts.
Tom and I took 2 new airplanes with external tanks and went around the enemy territory to get to Tullahoma. And we signed off the paperwork, and we were planning on waiting for a C-47 to pick us up. The colonel in command of that fighter group said, "We've got 2 airplanes that have a lot of battle damage, but they're okay to fly, but not okay to go into combat with." Tom said, "The engines check out okay, let's go for it."
But Tom's airplane quickly developed a problem.
"Bob, I've got a rough engine." I looked over, I could see the puffs of black coming out of his exhaust stacks. And I said, "Tom, do you see that little plateau over there on the top of that mountain?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "That's the only chance you've got." I said, "Or else you'll bail out and we'd never find you in these mountains." And I said, "Why don't you take a look at it and make your decision?" And so he looked at it and he said, "I'm going for it." And he got down and got stopped.
Bob later wrote, "I knew Tom would never have left me in a similar situation. I was determined that we'd either both make it back or neither one of us would." Tom Watts later wrote, "He pulled around and dragged the field, then his gear moved down slowly and locked. Was this damn fool gonna land?" He did, and it was a beauty. He brought his ship over alongside of me. My buddy wouldn't leave me. The P-40s Bob Hoover and Tom Watts were flying were single-seat planes, and only Bob's was flyable. Bob somehow flew both of them home with an open canopy.
We tried to squeeze him in, and I took my parachute off and just used the parachute as a seat cushion so I could see out adequately. And he put his feet down in here like this on the sides of the seat, and then leaned over, and this much of his head over here, this much was sticking out in the wind. You couldn't close the canopy. And my face was against the gun sight. Well, I took off, and I decided we couldn't get above 140 knots because he's going to be in the wind with his face. And he had his eyes protected and his little leather helmet on. And we were looking good on the fuel for making it. But it was a miserable experience for, I suppose 2 hours. My face pressed against the gun sight, and his mouth was torn back through the corners of his lips here from the wind catching his mouth when he'd try to say something. And we got there, and it was almost dark. I said, "I've got a Mayday," and explained the situation to the controller, and we went in and they cleared the field because I didn't know if I was going to be able to land it because I was slid down in the seat too, and I didn't know if I had enough room to pull the stick or if I could see well enough. And I was really planted against that head, that gun sight. And we got on the ground and taxied in okay. And I looked at his face, and boy, I couldn't believe it. And he said, "Look at yours when you get a chance." I was black and blue from that gun sight on the side of my face. Well, he was black and blue the next day, and we were two happy clowns. But that, to me, was the most outstanding thing that I did in World War II.
Remember, Bob had refused the offer of automatic commission as a flight officer because that kind of commission would have left him unqualified for combat. And combat was his goal from the beginning. In the course of doing his job in the Ferry Command, specifically delivering new P-40s to a fighter unit, he took his destiny into his own hands.
Got all 6 P-40s on the ground safely, and I went into the tent to do the paperwork, and they were putting all of their gear into the B-25. And a 2-star general, I looked up and there he was, and he said, "Young man, I'd like to talk to you about your mission." And I said, "Sir," I said, "I came into this Air Force to fly for our country and fight the enemy. And I said, I had a taste of it in England. And each assignment I've had since has had nothing to do with combat. And I said, I think I'm as qualified to be a good fighter pilot as anybody could be. I said, I can hit the target consecutively, right side up or inverted. And I said, I can hit a target out of 4 consecutive loops. And that means every loop has to be perfectly round to be in position to fire on the target each time you come through. And it's very difficult. Most people do loops and they're sort of L-shaped. You move out. And he listened to me and he said, "Young man," he said, "that's a hell of a story." He said, "If you can really fly that well." And I said, "Well, sir, you could contact Colonel McNichol because he's watched me do these demonstrations I do." And I said, he told me if I could ever get a transfer that he'd make me a flight leader if I could get an appointment to his outfit. And he's in the 52nd Fighter Group. He commands it. He said, "Son, you'll have your orders within 2 weeks."
But things weren't quite that simple. Perhaps they never are. But then again, this is Bob Hoover we are talking about.
Nothing happened. Weeks went by. Nothing happened. And I was getting other assignments. And I was just down in the dumps in the worst way. And finally this sergeant called me, and he was a clerk for this Colonel Epwright, whom I reported to as head of Ferry Command. He said, "Mr. Hoover, your orders have been on the colonel's desk since you went on that trip to Sicily." And he said, "I asked the colonel when he was going to tell you about it. And he said, I'm not going to tell him about it. I'm not going to let him transfer. I'm going to keep him right here." I picked up the phone and I called the colonel. And I said, "Colonel, I just had a phone call from headquarters, fibbing." And I said, "They wanted to know why I hadn't reported for duty in Sicily." And he said, "Because I'm damn well not going to let you go." He said, I cannot operate this thing without you." And I said, "Well, sir, I'm really disappointed you feel that way." And he said, "Well, you've got to get that in your head that you're not going to be able to get transferred." And so I said, well, thank you, sir. And my next flight was to Palermo, Sicily with Spitfires to the 52nd Fighter Group.
Yep, you guessed it. Once he got to the 52nd Fighter Group, knowing the general's orders were in fact sitting on his boss's desk, he had no intention of returning to the Ferry Command.
I put my foot locker in the back of the airplane, and I took two co-pilots I'd been training to be a pilot on the B-25, and I had led Spitfires, 6 of them, into Palermo, Sicily. And when I got there, I said, fellas, you're on your own. And I took my foot locker out of the airplane, and I asked someone on the line to take me over in a Jeep to the colonel's office. And boy, he put his arms around me and he said, oh, I've been hoping this day would come. And he said, I've told all of the people in this fighter group about your expertise. And he said, I want you to put on a show for all of them. And so he brought all the 3 squadrons were located in different places into Palermo. He got everybody assembled and he said, you're going to see something you've never seen before. But I want you to know one thing. If I catch any one of these you fighter pilots trying to duplicate what you're going to witness, I'm going to have you grounded.
Bob Hoover believed, his bosses believed, and those who saw him fly fighters in those days believed he was simply the best there ever was, which makes what happened to him in combat all the more surreal.
The day I was shot down, we were dive bombing some transports, feeding supplies to the Germans in southern France there. And we were attacked by 4 Focke-Wulf 190s. And we just pulled off of the target of releasing our bombs, and we were all split up. I pulled out of a break like this, and I was up about almost 90 degrees, and I saw this Focke-Wulf out here, and I just ignored him. About that time, I was hit. And believe it or not, it was a 90-degree deflection shot. Well, I knew I had no choice. The fire was so bad, I just rolled it upside down, and I hoped that they wouldn't hit me again. And I just rolled it upside down and fell out, hit the water, got tangled up in my parachute lines. And then I sat there in the water, and I had shrapnel that came all through the bottom of the airplane. And I was in the water all afternoon, and a German Corvette was searching for 2 of their pilots that had gone down, and they found me. And I remember for as long as I lived trying to sink my escape kit because I didn't want the Germans to catch it. I'm sure by then they must have had hundreds of them. But it was a little encasement that had a saw blade encased in rubber, which you inserted in your rectum. And it had a cloth map of the area we were fighting in. And it had some chocolate bars, some other things that could keep you from severe pain. It was a Corvette, and it had like a ladder coming down with a platform on the bottom right near the waterline. So finally they had a long pole with a hook on it, and they hooked me and pulled me onto that platform.
Being a prisoner of the Germans was a new reality for Bob, but it didn't change him. It just gave him a new set of objectives.
They took me off and put me in a dungeon, and I lived with the rats for the next day or so. And then they took me out for interrogation. They took me to a real fine hotel that was a billeting spot for all the German officers in that area. And the families were with them. in some cases, and they tied me up on a big column in the lobby with my hands behind me like this, and the wives would come by and spit on me and slap me. And I did understand why, because so many of them had lost their families and their homes in the bombings that we were doing, and I endured it. Of course, I was mad and a hornet at the time it was happening, but as I reflected on it, well, I had the wrong attitude. I wanted to escape, and I never quit trying till the day I did.
Bob endured 16 months in that camp. He repeatedly tried to escape, but was caught, beaten, and put in solitary each time. But gaining his freedom was now Bob's focus. And I believe determination was the engine that drove Bob Hoover in every circumstance of his life. Bob was in that camp so long that the Allies had nearly defeated Germany. In fact, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces in Europe, issued a new order to pilots and airmen being held in German prison camps. It told them to stop risking their safety with escape attempts because they would shortly be liberated anyway. But again, this is Bob Hoover we are talking about.
I ignored that. I kept right on attempting to escape because I wanted out. The war in Japan was still going on, and I wanted to get in on that. The day I got out, I got a diversion going. I got some of the fellas that I'd worked with on some of the escape attempts to start a fight. And once they started the fight, got all the guards' attention, but half of the guards had deserted by then. We could hear the big guns about 50, 70 miles away. And we got to the other side, and now we were away from the Germans for the most part, out in open countryside.
After 3 days on the run in Germany, a very hungry Bob Hoover and his fellow escapee came to a farmhouse occupied by the wife of a German officer. Her husband was based elsewhere. Luckily, she spoke English. In exchange for some food, Bob wrote her a letter to give to the advancing Allied troops. The letter asked the Allies to treat her kindly because of the help she had provided him. As he was leaving, she also gave him a pistol. Bob was on the hunt for a German airplane he could use to fly himself to the Allied lines and freedom. As he continued to move around the German countryside, he was in and out of the lines of the Russian troops. The Russians were vengeful enemies. Bob witnessed unspeakable brutality inflicted on Germans by the Russians. Eventually, Bob made his way to a deserted airfield and started looking for an airplane.
Finally, I found one that was full of bullet holes, but the engine was okay, and it was full of fuel. And I said, I'm going to wait till a mechanic walks by here, and I'm going to put the gun on him and bring him in here and help him get the airplane started. And so finally a German mechanic did come by, and I pointed the gun at him and yelled, and I motioned for him to come into the revetment, and he walked in there. And boy, he put his hands up, and his face was just pale as a ghost.
The Germans showed Bob how to start the Focke-Wulf 190 airplane, and Bob decided it would be too risky to taxi the airplane slowly out to a runway. He simply firewalled it out of the revetment where it was parked.
Well, I let it go, and I went straight out of that revetment, got airborne, got the gear up, and there was a 4,000-foot ceiling. And I no more than got off the ground, and I started thinking, you know, this is the dumbest thing you've ever done. Here you are in an enemy airplane, and the war's not over, and our Air Force people come in and see you. They're going to take an easy pot shot at you, and you did. And I headed north till I got to the North Sea. Then I swung west, and I thought, if I've got enough fuel to get to Holland, I'll see windmills and I'll know I'm in safe country.
Bob had eventually landed the German airplane in a field in Holland. What he had no way of knowing was that under Nazi occupation, the Dutch population had experienced the highest per capita death rate of any country occupied by Hitler's forces. Now that they had been liberated, the local population was not likely to warmly welcome a pilot who had emerged from a German airplane. He was immediately surrounded by farmers with pitchforks and other weapons. They were marching him down a road when they encountered a British convoy. Bob was able to describe his situation to them, and the Brits intervened.
It was sort of a hair raiser and a very dumb thing to have done. The war was practically over, but all I'd thought about every day, all day long, was getting out and capturing one of their airplanes, and I was so motivated.
The day Bob Hoover stole that German airplane and flew himself to freedom, he was 23 years old. The war in Europe was within months of being over when Bob escaped. Plans to turn our attention to the Pacific and Japan became moot with the atomic bombings of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945. After getting home, Bob wrote, "I had spent nearly 2.5 years overseas. It was an experience I'll never forget. I had seen the extremes of bravery and brutality, of kindness and cruelty, of loyalty and cowardliness. Above all, I knew more than ever what it meant for one to lose that precious gift of freedom."
When you first lose your freedom, and I've said this to so many young people, you don't know what we have here in this country till you can't see that red, white, and blue flag. You don't know what that stands for. That's freedom.
Air Force films of the Army's newest fighting plane, the jet-propelled P-80 Shooting Star. The P-80 is believed to be the fastest fighter in existence. The secret of its spectacular speed lies in the new knife-edged wing and its powerful kerosene-burning jet engine.
World War II was the dawn of the jet age. Few inventions have done more to shrink the geographic and cultural distances between peoples than the jet engine. We are now in our third generation of people who take the speed, reliability, and comfort of jets for granted. In part, we can thank Bob Hoover for that. Bob Hoover became a U.S. Air Force test pilot following the war. He was one of a handful of pilots who took on the arduous and dangerous task of flying the new jets, including America's first jet, the P-80.
It was an experience for those of us who flew some of those early jets. You see, we had to change engines. Started out at 2 hours, and we got up to 5 hours and to 10 hours just for the life of the engine. And so there was always maintenance going on with the jets. They didn't have a fuel control, and most people wouldn't understand this, but in starting a jet engine back in those days without a fuel control, you were the fuel controller. And you'd do it like this when you'd start the engine, because if you let if the RPM didn't start moving upward when you were trying to start it, you'd overheat the engine, so you glued your eyes to the tailpipe temperature and the RPM, and it would take you maybe 2 or 3 minutes to get an engine started, because then when you once got it started, to go from idle to taxi speed, you couldn't just put the throttle up. You had to ease it up and ease it back
again, watching the temperature and RPM. And now to get up to speed, engine speed for takeoff, you'd have to sit there and play with it like this again. And now this meant that after you finished your flight and wanted to land, there was no margin for error, because if you found you were too slow or short of the runway, you'd never get the throttle up there to get the power to make you reach the runway.
Something to think about the next time you sink into your seat on an airliner. While assigned to right field, Bob quickly learned that being a test pilot during the day paid certain dividends when he and his friends went out in the evening. On a blind date in Dayton, he met Colleen Humrickhouse. She later said, "The thing that held Bob back was my maiden name. He used to introduce me as Colleen Jones." Her name soon became Colleen Hoover, and it remained so for 68 years until her death in March of 2016. Bob Hoover was a true Southern gentleman. I flew with him on the airshow circuit for so long, and we became such close friends that it was easy to think of him as just one of the guys. It was easy to forget what an important role he played in aviation history. For example, guess who demonstrated the jet airplane to the inventor of powered flight, Orville Wright?
The colonel asked me to take this one airplane, and it was on a test phrase, and I put on an aerobatic demonstration for him. And he came over to the airplane. He had some people with him, of course, and I was getting in the airplane, and he shook hands with me and told me he was interested in watching me fly. And then when I came back, why, he congratulated me, and that was just a couple of handshakes, but I was awe-inspired by saying that I'd met the man.
That's just another thing that's a little hard to get your head around when considering the life of R.A. Bob Hoover. He was born just 14 years after powered flight was invented. He personally met Orville Wright. He flew anything and everything for the next 6 decades as a combat pilot, military test pilot, civilian test pilot, and an executive at North American Rockwell, the aerospace company that built the command module for the Apollo moon landing program and the Space Shuttle orbiters. Bob Hoover painted on a canvas that stretched from Kitty Hawk to the moon. Albert Einstein said, "Intellectuals solve problems. Geniuses prevent them." Preventing problems was indeed the genius of Bob Hoover. As a test pilot, he knew that any problem he discovered could be solved before mass production was begun. In the world of aviation, that meant saving lives. Bob suffered no fools and made no compromises when it came to the hard realities of building safe airplanes and flying them properly. But standing one's ground in test flight often means speaking truth to power, and that can have consequences. One of the issues with the new jet airplanes was that their engines ran on jet fuel or kerosene, not gasoline. That was going to mean setting up a whole new fuel distribution system around the world, or finding a way for the jets to fly on gasoline. After several tests of gasoline in the engines, it fell to Bob to perform an aerobatic routine for the Air Force brass. Bob later wrote, "Suddenly at 10,000 feet, the engine flamed out. He survived the crash landing with only very minor injuries." Later that afternoon, he was ready for another flight to test ramjets in a P-51 Mustang. Colonel Albert Boyd, the head of the test flight division at Wright Field, thought otherwise. He ordered Bob out of the airplane. Boyd had counted up the number of forced landings Bob had and found them to be more frequent than other pilots in the division. Though Bob routinely took the riskiest flights, Boyd added, nobody else seemed to be having these kind of problems. It was likely the beginning of the end of Bob's Air Force career when he replied, "Well, Colonel, if you'd come down here and fly more often, you could assume some of the risks too." In 1946 and 47, the race to break the sound barrier was on. America's entry was the X-1 built by the Bell Aircraft Company. The project's civilian test pilot, Chalmers Goodland, was scheduled to make the first supersonic flight. There are conflicting accounts as to why he did not. The net result was the news broke at the Wright Field Flight Test Center that the Air Force was seeking a volunteer to break the sound barrier. Several of the pilots, including Bob Hoover, applied. According to Bob Hoover's autobiography titled Forever Flying, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Council had chosen him to make the flight. But then Bob did a favor for a fellow pilot, a favor that changed history.
I was selected for the X-1 program and was asked by a friend of mine who wasn't flying jets, fly over the Springfield airport the first chance you get with the jet, and I'll tell them it was me. That's mistake number one.
In most of the jet test flights, every ounce of fuel was consumed. But on one flight, the weather was so bad, Bob could not get accurate data, so he broke it off.
So I came back and I had a lot of fuel, and there was Springfield Airport underneath. I just make a trip across the upside down. I did. The numbers on the side of the airplane were small, and I never thought anything about it. 2 months went by, and I was elated about being selected for the X-1 program. And a new colonel came in, and he said, I just got a letter here saying that somebody buzzed the Springfield airport on such and such a date. Was that you? I said, yes, sir, it was. He said, well, I know 2 things about you. You're honest because there was only one jet that flew in the whole United States that day, and you were in it. But I also know that you're not responsible. He said, you're going to help him out. You're going to live with him. You're going to fly with him. You're going to be his backup pilot. And I thought, oh, boy, there were 16 people in that pyramid of candidates to get to that peak I had made. And now I've lost it all.
Of course, history tells us that as a result of Bob's decision, one of aviation's most significant milestones, exceeding the speed of sound for the first time, was accomplished by his close friend, General Chuck Yeager, with Bob flying the chase plane. Interestingly enough, when the Allison Division of General Motors was looking for a chief test pilot and sought the Air Force's advice, Colonel Albert Boyd, the same colonel Bob Hoover had accused of lacking the courage to make the risky flights, told them Bob Hoover was the best in the business, and General Motors recruited him aggressively.
You will be the highest paid 27-year-old in the General Motors Corporation if you accept this job. And they had just lost a pilot. And so I was accepted. And the first thing he said to me is, I'll not only double your pay, but we will give you a brand new Cadillac of any design you want. You can give us the paint job and the interior, and all of the goodies that would spark an interest in any young guy.
So Bob Hoover became a civilian test pilot. And as you might imagine, the kid from Nashville, Tennessee, who purposely made himself sick in order to keep flying, became a legend in that world as well. There was a reason for Bob Hoover to title his book, Forever Flying. It was the tyranny of biology, age alone, that finally dragged him out of the cockpit for the final time. It's kind of funny, but when my generation of pilots encountered Bob Hoover, we didn't think, there's Bob Hoover, the guy who broke out of the prison camp and stole a German airplane. Or there's Bob Hoover, the guy who rescued his friend off a mountaintop by jamming him in a single-seat airplane. Or there's Bob Hoover, who could have broken the sound barrier. Or there's Bob Hoover, who laid healing hands on everything from the P-39 to the F-86, the F-100, the Sabreliner, and even the F-18. When I met him, he was just one of us, doing what he'd been doing since he was teaching the teachers in the Tennessee Air National Guard, demonstrating airplanes for people, but with superhuman grace and elegance. Nobody had a touch like Bob Hoover.
Now, the difficult thing to think about is
try to pour backhanded to see it on camera. Believe it or not, you can see the horizon going around as the tea is poured into the glass.
He said at times you had to be gentle enough to milk a mouse. No matter how many offices or neckties they put him in, he always made them agree to let him keep flying. Bob Hoover was an artist, and his inspiration was the unknown.
There's something about the unknown, and that's why I was so disappointed that I didn't get to make the first flight on the X-1. Every day you go out, you have no idea what the rest of the day it has in store for you. And you get used to that. The adrenaline flows, and you get excited about it, and you feel motivated because if you can damage the enemy, that's why you're there. And I had been doing aerobatics, and I was sought after to perform and demonstrate different types of airplanes all over the world. And I enjoyed every one of those flights because they were in different countries and before people that were enthusiastic about flying and wanted to know more about it. And that in itself was another bit of adrenaline flowing, because I can tell you for a fact, you couldn't imagine how many accidents I've seen in my lifetime where the pilots didn't survive.
Bob Hoover's career covered an arc from the Wright brothers and Kitty Hawk to today's space age. His list of personal friends, admirers, and flying mates included Orville Wright, Charles Lindbergh, Jimmy Doolittle, Chuck Yeager, Yuri Gagarin, John Glenn, Neil Armstrong, and hundreds more. And most of them would agree with Jimmy Doolittle. He was the best there ever was. But if we miss the other aspects of Bob Hoover's gift, we miss everything. Courage, both physical and moral, loyalty, integrity. In the wild blue yonder, truth is uncompromising. To Bob, that could not change on the ground. Generosity. Bob never stopped sharing. Advice, knowledge, inspiration, opportunities. He knew sharing these things could save lives, so he shared them tirelessly. Patriotism. Nobody believed more strongly in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness than R.A. Bob Hoover. And I think something happened to him when he lost his liberty in that prison camp. The sanctity of freedom took up residence in his heart. You took your dignity in your own hands if you failed to properly respect the United States flag or a veteran in the presence of Bob Hoover.
I was enthusiastic. I had high ideals and expectations because I had learned a lot of things about aviation that other people had not had an opportunity to do. I never felt that I was any better than any other pilot. I just felt this is what I want to do, and I want to do it to the best of my ability.
But what made my friend Bob Hoover so special and so important to aviation and the nation was not the gifts he possessed, it was his undying willingness to share them with the rest of us.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.